The original design of Congress was designed to be a bicameral legislature. This has the House of Representatives and the Senate in order to balance the interests of small states versus large states. Um, it's supposed to be the central point of government by being an effective transfer of power from the executive branch to the legislative branch, and then also be able to effectively and efficiently pass relevant legislation. So the idea that really hinders the original design of Congress is the idea of reelection. So the House of Representatives, as stated in the Constitution, is up for reelection every 2 years, and the Senate is up for reelection every 6 years, with the idea of rotation, which is staggering of senatorial terms, such that 1/3 of the Senate comes up for reelection every 2 years. So this is this like why reelection affects Congress is because it creates single-minded seekers of reelection within the legislative branch, where instead of focusing on actually passing legislation, they spend their time in their districts. Like this is Kay Granger visiting a school in Fort Worth, and they avoid controversial and electorally risky bills. And they also dramatically criticize the other side while actually like not doing anything themselves in legislation, and only voting for partisan bills that appeal to their very partisan district.
Okay, now, in order to stay elected, you have to stay relevant, and by becoming reelected, you become an incumbent. By being an incumbent, there are many advantages, one being seniority. The basic idea of seniority is that the longer you stay in office, the more power and the more well-known you have and the more influence you'll have on others. One example off the top of my head is Dianne Feinstein, only because she's a senator from California. She's been in there for 28 years and she has definitely had an influence. Another evidence for the incumbent advantage is lobbyists. John McCain, although there have been ties to John McCain for working with lobbyists, I chose him because he is the most paid from, he received the most donations from one of the biggest lobbying groups out there, which is the NRA, and he has been a senator for a very long time until his unfortunate death in 2018. Casework applies to everyone in Congress. All congressmen and their staffs have to do casework. However, how well you do in the casework and how friendly, I suppose, you are and how helpful you are to those you represent, the better reputation you have, and thus more people are going to vote for you to stay in, and thus you stay in there longer. Next slide. Further evidence, blatantly, is these two bar graphs. Statistically speaking, those who stay in office tend to be reelected, as shown by these graphs, with some outliers. But the trend is that if you're in, you stay in. Next slide. History. In the early days of Congress, elections were very simple. They're held outside. Either you would do a hand raise, say yay or nay, or you would do a box vote where you would write who you want and drop into a box. Another popular form of voting in early Congress was the block voting, where it was a sort of winner takes all, where whoever got the most votes became a senator or a rep and got into office. Only problem with block voting is that there would be preset ballots, and certain parties would push their own agenda by having everyone of their party have these same preset votes. The apportionment acts they try to get more representation in our government, and these would take place every 10 years after a census, until 1911, where we decided on a set number of seats in the House at 435, and we would change how many seats per state based on population, but it would stay a set 435. As for term limits for senators and House of Representatives, it has stayed the same since early Congress, where there is no really term limit. only the type, how often, and the intervals between each election. Next slide.
So the solution that we picked would be implementing term limits, but we would have to revisit the term limits case. Term limits would help keep elected officials focused on legislation rather than preparing for re-election. Because officials often put a lot of time into securing funding and keeping their reputation clean within their party for re-election. Also, it would allow for better time management because oftentimes they focus on meeting quotas for funding every day so they can help prepare. And also, like Luke said, incumbent. The incumbent have an advantage, and it would make it easier for those who do not have the incumbent advantage to gain funding and work their way into Congress. It would allow for more competition, which would allow for more of an incentive to get things accomplished. The representatives should be judged on what they can get done rather than their reputations and what they may have got accomplished in previous years. Also, it limits the influence of wealthy supporters. Receiving donations from wealthy individuals and organizations often comes at a price as they're expecting something in return. These individuals do not necessarily focus These individuals do not necessarily focus on what's important to the people, but rather these few people that are backing them, allowing for a lot of the power to be held by a small group of people with a very niche